Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. Today, I'm going to answer a question that comes up a lot in the comments section of my videos. And that question is, where have all the heroes gone? And I'm going to answer that question in a roundabout way by picking up on another thread of conversation that usually happens in my comments. And it starts with the statement that women can't be true heroes. So I'm going to answer that question and then bring it back to the original question. Now, before I start, I just want to thank everybody who posts comments on my videos. I love the conversations that go on in the comment section of my videos. I don't get to see them all because of the odd way that YouTube shows the owner of a page what is going on. It's very, very odd. But I love these conversations that go on. That having been said, let's look at this statement that I've seen a number of times. This statement that truly women can't be heroes. And this is based upon, usually, the statement that women simply don't know what it is to sacrifice. Not like a man does. They don't self-sacrifice like a man does. Self-sacrifice is at the heart of all these virtues that I'm always talking about. These virtues lead a person to become a paragon of virtue, and a paragon of virtue is what allows you to become a hero. And so if the person can't get into that mindset of self-sacrifice, then they simply can't be a hero. Now, while I agree that whole dynamic that I described now is true, that if you can't be self-sacrificial, you can't be a hero. But at the same time, I would say that yes, indeed, women can be heroes. And they can be heroes in the same mechanism that men can be heroes. That is to say, they can access these same virtues that I'm always talking about as the males do. And I would say this is a fundamental part of the essence of a human being, whether they be male or female. But let's just look at it in the terms that I always talk about. The fact that in Western civilization, these virtues number 4, and they go prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance, specifically in that order. I would say women can access these virtues, and women can certainly become paragons of virtue according to these virtues, and women can become heroes, but there is something that distinguishes a male hero from a female hero. Now, I started thinking about all of this after I did my last video, which was about Ann Nocenti being interviewed by Sana Amanat. So, if you don't know, Ann Nocenti was a writer for Marvel Comics back in the 1980s. She was a great writer, in my estimation. She got me to read Daredevil for almost 2 decades, buying every Daredevil book that I could find. And she was writing male heroes. And she was being interviewed by Sana Amanat, who is the current second in command at Marvel Comics, the VP of Content and Character Development for Marvel Comics at present. And as people had said in the comments, what we had here in this interview was Ann Nocenti, who was a second-wave feminist, talking to Sana Amanat, who was a third-wave feminist. And if you looked at their conversation in a stark light, which I did, you can see how these two women disagree. And I think the fundamental point of disagreement came when Ann Nocenti said the following. She said that there was indeed something that made women shy away from an escalation narrative and to shy away from a fight. And just briefly, she had to couch that in terms of, I don't want to get attacked for saying this, but I believe it to be true because I think she knew very well who she was talking to and what kind of audience she was talking to. But she believes that, yes, there is a fundamental difference between a male and a female, and for females, the fight doesn't come naturally. And she said that furthermore, this leads into the fact that you have superhero comics, and superhero comics fundamentally come down to a fight. It comes down to an escalation narrative that leads to a conflict, that leads to a fight, and that's what a superhero comic is. That's what she said. Now, Sana Amanat completely disagreed with her on this. She said, no, it doesn't have to come down to a fight. You have superhero comics now. We don't want that. There are a whole bunch of other things that we can concentrate on, and they are superhero comics. But for Ann Nocenti, writing back in the 1980s for Marvel, writing great runs of Marvel Comics, she believed that it came down to a fight, and that this fight was what was the basis of a superhero comic. But she also said that, she was writing as a man, as if she was a man. She was trying to play in the boys' league, and she knew very well who her audience was. She knew that they were men. So she knew that if she was going to write a good story and give her audience what they wanted, she needed to understand this male conflict mindset. And she goes over that in the interview itself, talking about how she had to do all of these things, these male conflict kind of things, in order to understand exactly what was going on with this conflict within the stories that she was going to write. And this eventually led her to understand what she was doing when she was writing a hero. Now, let's step back for a minute and look at a superhero comic itself, because this is what we're discussing here, superhero comics. Now, if you break it down to its fundamental two building blocks, you have a superhero. And I would say that you can further break down hero into being a paragon of virtue, which is then broken down into those separate virtues that I talked about earlier. So hero can be broken down into virtue. Whereas super, well, super is a descriptor for extraordinary power. So you have these characters that have extraordinary power. So super can be reduced down to power. So you have, on the one hand, power, and on the other hand, virtue. And this is what makes up a superhero. And I would say this plays right into what Ann Nesenti was talking about, the difference between a male and a female. Because, well, let's just look at it physically. We're not looking at the essence of what it is to be a male or a female, because I would say the essence of a human being, no matter whether you're male or female, is the same. Your soul, if you want to call it that, is the same. But if we're looking just physically, men and women are fundamentally different. This cannot be denied by anybody who is able to think rationally. On the whole, that is to say, taking all men on average, men are bigger, stronger, have more muscle mass, have denser bones, have more lung capacity. All of these things are in the physical nature of what it is to be a man. Whereas for a woman has different physical attributes. Those physical attributes are things like the fact that, well, she has a uterus, which you can grow a human being in. A man doesn't have that. Or you can look at the fact that women can endure pain, or at the very least, some very specific kinds of pain, much better than men. Or the fact that women's eyes are constructed differently from men's eyes. And yes, we know this scientifically. I went over this in one of my older videos where I talked about color in modern comics. Women's eyes have different cells within them than men's eyes do, and women, through women's eyes, are able to see more shades of color than males can. And if we take all of these physical parts of the nature of a man and the physical parts of the nature of a woman, we come down to what the purpose of these things are. And really, what the purpose of the male physical nature is the fact that they're going to get into conflict because they need to defend what they hold dear. And what they hold dear would be the woman and the child. Whereas for a woman, all of these things, they're built around motherhood and nurturing that child. Because they're able to give birth to this child because of their physical nature. They're able to endure certain kinds of pain more because giving birth to a child is extremely painful. They're able to see these different shades of color that men cannot because they're able to tell whether or not their child is starting to get sickly. They can tell that, oh look, my child is 2 shades of white off of what they usually are. Something must be wrong. Therefore, I must get the medical attention right away, which allows them to make sure that they care for this child and that they keep the child alive quicker, easier. And this is not, as the feminists would want you to believe, any kind of taught behavior. There have been, again, scientific studies on tiny little babies when they can first see, and they're able to tell that male children visually are drawn more towards the mechanical, and female children visually are drawn more towards human faces. So, as soon as we're born, if you're born a male, you start to look outside of yourself for things that are mechanical, things that might be a threat to you, because your nature, your physical nature, is built around conflict, which comes from defense. Whereas the females, they're looking towards human faces, so they can understand things like emotion and nonverbal communication, which allows them to take care of their child easier. And I'm going over all of this because this physical nature of a man and this physical nature of a woman leads straight into what it means to be a hero. Because again, hero comes from being virtuous. And there is a definition of virtue, a sort of, we'll call it mechanical definition of virtue, which I rarely talk about, but it is one of the definitions that, again, has accompanied Western civilization for thousands of years. And it's the idea that virtue is the ability or the power that allows you to fulfill your ends. And it's not a chosen end. It's not, I choose this for myself as an end and therefore I'm going in that direction. No, it means end as in a fulfillment of your nature. So the power that allows you to fulfill your nature is one of the definitions of virtue. And the thing is that this doesn't just happen for human beings. This happens for other living things as well. One of the ways that I usually like to describe it is the fact that, let's say you have an apple tree. An apple tree that is laden down with as much fruit as possible is said to be in its virtue. Why? Because it is the nature of an apple tree to bear fruit. Therefore, when it has the power to bear as much fruit as possible, again, it is fulfilling its nature. This is called virtue, and therefore the tree is said to be in its virtue. But at the same time, let's say you took the same apple tree and you planted it somewhere where it wasn't going to actually receive the right amount of water, or it wasn't going to receive the right amount of sunlight, and it never bore any fruit whatsoever in its entire life. It doesn't matter. It is still the nature of that apple tree to bear fruit. Even if it never bears any fruit, it's still part of its nature to do so, and it will still struggle for the power to complete that nature throughout its entire life. It will still struggle to be in its virtue. So let's bring this back to superheroes, again, which we broke down into two categories, power and virtue. And as Ann Nesenti said, what is a superhero comic? Well, it comes down to a fight. It comes down to an escalation narrative, a conflict, and a fight. And what nature does that play to? Well, that plays towards the male nature. Again, she knew this, and she was saying, I'm writing as if I were a man, for men, and I know very well that it comes down to a fight. Why? Because she knows very well that conflict is in the nature of a man. That is to say that a man is to fulfill his nature by defending that which cannot defend itself. That is what is going to happen. Even if the man never gets to do so in his life, still that is part of his nature. So he will always seek to test himself, because what is a conflict? Well, a conflict is the test of power between two or more individuals, and which one is going to will out. And when you look at it that way, you see very well how power is connected to the heroic for a male, because a male is supposed to be fulfilling their nature of defending that which cannot defend itself. This leads to conflict. This leads to an exertion of power on behalf of the male to defend what cannot defend itself. That use of power leads him to fulfill his nature, which leads him to be in his virtue, which leads to those virtues that we're always talking about, which leads him to be a paragon of virtue, which leads him to be a hero. So those two fundamental things that we can break down superhero into, power and virtue, for a male, one feeds right into the other. And they are indeed complementary to each other. But here's where we run into a problem. For a female, that's not the case, because the nature of a female is not to get into conflict. The nature of a female is to reproduce and to take care of that offspring. And so for a woman to fulfill this nature, it behooves her to stay away from conflict as much as possible, so she can concentrate on fulfilling her nature. And the thing is, this can play out very well in other kinds of storytelling, especially where you have something like a novel, where everything is almost internal dialogue. This works very well. You can have a female hero, describe them and what they are going through very well when the entire thing is taking place within the mind of the reader. It works very well in those kinds of mediums. But it doesn't work very well in the medium of comic books, because the medium of comic books is at the very least 50% visual, and these things which a woman needs to do to fulfill her nature are things like being motherly, are things like caring. This is what she needs to do, and those do not translate well at all into a visual medium. And again, this feeds right back into what I was talking about before with the little children, with the male child and the female child. Males, we know this, again, scientifically, males are attracted much more to the visual than females are. Why? Because males need to look out for what is coming and they need to defend against it, where females, they need to think about the internal. They need to think about caring. They need to think about things like nonverbal communication between two individuals. That's how they fulfill their nature. So that's number one. Within a comic book, within a visual medium, this idea of how a woman actually fulfills those things which are part of her nature, which then leads her to virtue, do not translate very well onto the page. But that's just the first thing. The problem multiplies substantially when you start adding this quote-unquote progressive mindset into the problem. Because the progressive mindset, oddly enough, does something very hypocritical. It denies the fact that there are any kind of human natures at all. This is the only way they can get to their ends of their heaven on earth, their utopia, is to deny that any human being has any kind of nature whatsoever, so that these human beings can be infinitely malleable in order to change them into what a society needs. But let's put that aside for today. At the same time that they deny the nature of any kind of human being, they are taking the nature of a man and putting it into a woman, and taking the nature of a woman and putting it into a man. And they're trying to make women into men, and they're trying to make men into women. Now, I did an entire video discussing the historical and philosophical background of this. It's called the Carl Manvers effect. It's an older video of mine, and when I listen to it, I cringe because of the quality. But at the same time, the information is good, so I'll probably link that at the end and in the description if you want to go listen to it. But here's the thing. When you take the nature of a woman out of a woman and substitute in the nature of a man, then something becomes broken. And the same happens in the reverse when you do it for a man. Something breaks. Because you have these women who are trying to fulfill the ends of a man, but even physically, they don't have the ability to do so. And same with the male who has internalized a female nature. And so if you have this woman who has internalized a male nature, she can never fulfill her ends because she's ignoring the female ends altogether, and she's trying to fulfill the ends of a male nature, which she can never do. And since she can never fulfill that nature, again, she is cut off from the ability to be in her virtue, and therefore cannot be a hero. But it doesn't even stop there. Because if you have these females, and they're taking into themselves a male nature, it cannot fulfill the ends of being a female, which they naturally are. Therefore, there is a disconnect between power on the one hand and virtue on the other. And when there is a disconnect between these two things, when power cannot translate itself into virtue and support virtue, when power cannot be used for something greater, what do they do with that power? Well, they seek power for the sake of power. And briefly, just to go over a little bit of what I went over in that older video, where this all comes from in the modern terms is Nietzsche. Because Nietzsche's entire philosophy can be broken down into the idea of willing for the sake of willing and power for the sake of power. And he came up with nothing new whatsoever. All he did was to take the old ideas of Augustine of Hippo, who expressed the idea of will that we use today back in about 400 AD. All he did was take that, cut it off from virtue, and then flip it entirely on its head and say, everything he said, we need to do the opposite. And you want to know why he came up with this philosophy? Well, first of all, he had a mentor which was exactly like him. So I'm going to describe Nietzsche for you, but his mentor was exactly the same. Nietzsche came from a broken home. He didn't have a father. And so he didn't have a male role model in his life at all. He was raised by his mother, his aunts, and his sisters. And although I think he got a great many things wrong, one of the things he did get right was the fact that these women, in bringing him up in the way that they did, they robbed him completely of his male nature. And this was, again, in no small way, magnified by the fact that he didn't have a father or any kind of male role model at all. So you have this man, and what was substituted into him was a female nature. And therefore, he had a fundamental disconnect between power and virtue. And therefore, he said, well, virtue doesn't exist. And therefore, all he had was power that was going to serve power because it was stuck there, not being able to feed into anything greater. And therefore, he came up with a philosophy of willing for the sake of willing and power for the sake of power. In my study, I would say that all of modern feminism goes back to this one point of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche and their discussion of power and will. But as I said, I discussed that a lot more in my older video, so I'll just let that stand as it is. So what are we left with when we talk about superhero comics that are written by these quote-unquote progressives? We have women who want to be men, you have men who are acting like women, and so they are not connecting with their nature. If they're not connecting with their nature, they have power within them that can't go anywhere. It can't feed into anything greater. It can't feed into virtue. Therefore, they simply don't know what a hero is. All they can do is collect power for the sake of collecting power, and exercising power for the sake of exercising power. That's all that they do with their lives. And so when they build a character and call it a hero, these characters are fundamentally the same as they are. These characters cannot connect power to virtue. Therefore, all we see within these creators and their creations are people who cannot be a hero. Because, again, there's a fundamental disconnect within them. Now, as I said, if you have a normal female and she knows very well what her nature is and she wishes to fulfill her nature and she uses that power to fulfill that nature, become someone who is in their virtue, certainly they can develop the habits of these virtues that lead them to be heroic. But it calls for a very different kind of self-sacrifice than the male. The male is called to lay down his life and die for those who cannot defend themselves, whereas the woman is called to lay down her life and live for the sake of her offspring. And so, if we look at this in total, a number of things become readily apparent. One of those things is the fact that in this visual medium of comic books and superhero comic books, if it is going to be an actual healthy industry, yes, you're going to see many more male heroes than female heroes. Why? Because it translates onto the page much easier as a male hero in the traditional way that a hero is actually expressed. Again, not to say that you can't have female heroes and they can't be expressed this way. I'm just saying it's much, much harder to express them this way. Therefore, you're going to see less of them. And the other thing being that as long as these quote-unquote progressives have control over this industry, you're never going to see a true hero. If you do, it's because one of these creators is pulling the wool over the eyes of the people that they work for. Because, as I said, for these people, these creators, these people who are running the industry, and the characters that they create, there is a fundamental disconnect between them and their nature. This fundamental disconnect does not allow them to be virtuous in the way that they are meant to be, and therefore they can't be heroes. And the funny thing is that the more you look at it, the more you can see that this is exactly how you define a villain. This is what a villain is. A villain is trying to exercise their power, but there's a fundamental disconnect between that power and their ability to be virtuous with that power. Therefore, they collect power for the sake of power, and they exercise power for the sake of power. And so, no matter how many times these progressive creators try to create a character and slap the title of hero on them, they're nothing but villains. Because in their own lives, they are the exact same kind of people as they are portraying on the page. They are willing for nothing more than the sake of willing. They are seeking power for nothing more than the collection of power. And they themselves, within their own lives, are nothing more than villains. So, hopefully I've given you something new to think about. If I did, hit like. Hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. Alright, I'll see you later. Bye. Hey, I just realized that some of you may want a clearer understanding of how the idea of virtue that I talked about today connects with the idea of virtue that I'm talking about in all my other videos, so I figured I'd add this on at the end. So, in my estimation, the connection would be as follows. First of all, as human beings, we're not trees. As human beings, we have a special ability and a special power, and that special power is the power to choose. That is to say, we have a free will. And if you take your choices and make them in accord with reality, that is to say, in accord with right reason, then those choices become prudent. That is to say, they are under the virtue of prudence. And if you begin to make prudent decisions, then you can make further decisions that are in accord with the virtue of justice. And as it goes, then you can make decisions that are in accord with the virtue of fortitude or courage, which means you can further make decisions in accord with the virtue of temperance. And when you get to the end of temperance, temperance reorders your understanding of how reality actually works. It perfects your right reason to a better extent, which then allows you to make further and better prudent decisions, and then more just decisions, and then more courageous decisions, and then more tempered decisions, and then it goes around and around in a circle like that. Once you begin to practice these virtues in this circular way, and that circle is not broken because it's very easy to break the circle, but once you do that, then those virtues become habits. And when those virtues start to become habits, then the small amount of power that we are allowed with our free choosing starts to expand itself exponentially every time you go around in the circle. And so your decisions have more and more effect because of this connection with these virtues. And so our choices not only allow us more and more to fulfill what we choose to do with our lives, but in the end it allows us to be in our virtue itself, which allows us to fulfill our ends, plural, of what it is to be a human being. So I wanted to clarify that because I tried to lay out a sort of mechanical understanding of how things would proceed, A, B, C, D, E, F, in that fashion. But in the main video, sometimes it appears that A comes before F, and sometimes F comes before A. And the reason for that is because of this circular movement of choices and virtues and habits and how they go around and around. And I know some of you listen to my videos to try to understand how these ideas would play themselves out within a story context, so I wanted to make that as clear as possible for you. And as an aside, and possibly a little bonus for anyone who is still listening to me ramble on, yes, I am planning to take all of these ideas and to put them into a story, a comic book or graphic novel story. I actually at present have most of the story written and fleshed out. I'm trying to write scenes as of now. My problem is that I would like someone as an artist, or artists, because it would probably be more than one, who reflect my ideas in a very rational way. That is to say, to have an art style that is crisp and clear, possibly detailed, and someone who has a good understanding of how panel layout actually works. And that is really a tall order. Most of those people that I've come across are booked up until next year. So if any of you have any suggestions about a freelance artist that would meet those criteria, or if you yourself are a freelance artist that would meet those criteria, drop me a line. You could put it in the comments, but I would rather you use the email address that is in the description of this video. Anyway, a special thank you for everyone who listens to me ramble straight to the end. All right, I'll see you later. Bye.